There is a moment that catches many people off guard, and it usually does not happen when they hit $1 million or even 100,000. It often begins much earlier, somewhere after $20,000, when money stops feeling like a stream that appears and disappears and starts becoming something with shape, memory, and direction. Before that point, every dollar tends to feel like it already belongs to a bill, an emergency, a repair, or a small relief from pressure. The mind stays trapped in short cycles because the numbers are too small to create distance between today's need and tomorrow's plan. But once a person crosses $20,000, something changes even more than most people expect. Not because 20,000 is a magical number, but because it is often the first level at which money begins to behave differently inside both the financial system and the human mind. What makes this threshold so important is not luxury, status, or freedom in the dramatic sense people like to imagine. It is leverage of attention. Below that level, money is mostly defensive. It protects against disruption for a little while, but it rarely generates enough stability to change decision-making at a deeper level. Above that level, the individual starts to experience a new category of choice. Emergencies no longer erase the entire structure. A bad month becomes a problem, not a collapse. The future stops looking like a fog of unknown costs and begins to look like a series of trade-offs that can be managed with thought instead of panic. That is why everything changes even more after $20,000, because the real shift is not only in the account balance, it is in the architecture of the mind. Financial psychology has always been shaped by thresholds. Human beings do not experience money in a smooth, linear way. We tell ourselves that an extra $1,000 should feel exactly proportional to the previous 1,000, but that is rarely how perception works. The first few $1,000s reduce immediate fear. The next few create breathing room. Then, somewhere around a number like 20,000, depending on income, debt load, and living costs, the brain begins to update its internal model of survival. Scarcity no longer dominates every decision with the same force. When scarcity is intense, people think in compressed time horizons. They delay maintenance, accept bad terms, avoid long-term planning, and often choose certainty over optimization because uncertainty is too dangerous when margins are thin. Once the buffer becomes meaningful, the time horizon expands, and that alone changes behavior more than many people realize. To understand this mathematically, imagine a person whose monthly essential expenses are around $3,000. At $2,000 in savings, one major repair can wipe out everything. At $5,000, the person has protection but still lives close to the edge. At $10,000, there is more room, yet the account remains vulnerable to a medical cost, job interruption, family obligation, or sudden relocation. At $20,000, that same person now holds roughly 6 to 7 months of essential expenses. That is not wealth in the grand sense, but it is enough to alter risk perception. They can survive a temporary income gap without immediate damage. They can wait before making a desperate choice. They can compare options instead of grabbing the first available one. This matters because bad financial decisions are often not failures of intelligence, they are failures of margin. Margin is one of the least discussed forces in personal finance, even though it quietly explains why the same person can appear irrational in one season and disciplined in another. Without margin, every mistake is expensive, and every opportunity is difficult to act on. A discount on a useful asset means nothing if there is no liquidity to purchase it. A better apartment, a new certification, a business experiment, or a temporary career pivot may all make long-term sense, yet none of them can be reached when all mental energy is spent defending the present moment. $20,000 does not solve every problem, but it often creates enough margin for rationality to become more usable. The person has not become wiser overnight. They have simply reduced the tax that chaos places on thinking. There is also a more subtle shift that happens at this level, and it has to do with identity. Before a meaningful cash reserve exists, many people relate to money as something that passes through them. Income arrives, obligations absorb it, and the cycle repeats. After 20,000, especially if it was built deliberately rather than inherited or received suddenly, the relationship changes. Money becomes a structure that can be directed, protected, and multiplied over time. That does not mean the person is rich, but it means they begin to think like a steward rather than a survivor. This is one of the most important psychological transitions in wealth building, because the habits required to preserve and grow money are very different from the habits required merely to endure instability. Behavioral economics helps explain why this threshold can feel disproportionately powerful. Loss aversion is strongest when resources are thin, because every loss carries a higher percentage of damage. A $500 setback is annoying to someone with $50,000 in liquid reserves, but it can be devastating to someone with $1,500. The emotional weight of money is therefore heavier at low levels, and that emotional weight distorts planning. People become more present-biased, more risk-sensitive in some areas, and paradoxically more risk-seeking in others, especially when under pressure to escape their current situation. Once 20,000 is in place, the emotional volatility around ordinary setbacks often declines. The person does not become emotionless, but they become less easily pushed into reactive decisions by small disruptions. This is where many hidden economic traps start losing their power. Late fees, overdrafts, credit card interest, rushed transportation costs, emergency borrowing, poor quality replacements, and short-term consumption decisions all feed on instability. Being financially fragile is expensive not only because income is low, but because fragility increases the price of almost everything. The system rewards patience, comparison, and liquidity, while punishing urgency. A person with no cushion pays more for mistakes, more for convenience, and more for time. A person with $20,000 is not outside the system, but they are less exposed to its most punishing friction. They can buy durability instead of the cheapest temporary option. They can wait for the better deal. They can avoid borrowing at the worst possible moment. Over time, these differences compound quietly. Historical financial patterns show the same principle at larger scales. Families, businesses, and even nations behave differently when reserves cross a certain line. The presence of a buffer does not guarantee wise choices, but it increases the ability to absorb shocks without immediate breakdown. In every era, from merchant households to modern corporations, liquidity has done more than preserve assets. It has preserved optionality. Optionality is the ability to delay, redirect, negotiate, or endure. This is one of the hidden mechanics behind upward mobility. It is not only income growth that changes outcomes, but the point at which reserves become large enough to create strategic patience. $20,000 is often a personal version of that principle. Another reason everything changes even more after 20,000 is that growth begins to feel less abstract. At lower balances, investment returns can feel psychologically invisible. A 5% gain on $2,000 does not feel life-altering. Even disciplined saving may seem slow because the account is still dominated by contributions rather than compounding. But as balances rise, the person begins to witness money adding to itself in a more visible way. This matters because motivation often follows evidence. Once someone sees that preservation and steady allocation are producing actual movement, their behavior tends to stabilize. They become less interested in financial entertainment and more interested in process. The goal shifts away from dramatic wins and toward repeatable mechanics. Of course, this threshold is not universal. $20,000 means something different in a low-cost town than it does in a major city. It means something different to a single person than it does to a parent supporting dependents. It means something different to someone with no debt than to someone carrying high-interest obligations. But the deeper point is not the exact number. The point is that there is a level at which money starts changing the texture of life rather than only the quantity of comfort. and for many people that level begins around this range. It is the zone where money becomes less about immediate rescue and more about strategic control. That is why people are often surprised when crossing this line does not produce luxury, yet still feels deeply significant. The outside world may not notice much difference. The apartment may be the same, the car may be the same, the wardrobe may be the same, but internally the shift can be enormous. The person sleeps differently. They negotiate differently. They think about time differently. They can leave a bad situation with less fear. They can tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into urgency. They can focus for longer. In many cases, that mental quiet is more transformative than any visible purchase. The most useful way to think about $20,000 then is not as a finish line, but as a threshold of behavior. It is where the financial system begins to treat you slightly better because you can now interact with it from a less desperate position, and where your own psychology begins to cooperate with long-term thinking in a more natural way. From there, the mission is not to celebrate too early or imagine that all problems are solved, but to recognize that the game has changed. The next stage is about protecting the buffer, reducing fragility further, and converting stability into durable assets, wiser decisions, and a stronger identity. In the end, everything changes even more after $20,000 because money is not only arithmetic. It is emotional bandwidth, negotiating power, time horizon, and resistance to chaos. When those things improve, decisions improve, and when decisions improve, the future stops being something that merely happens to you. It becomes something you can start shaping with more patience, more clarity, and more control.